Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Reason for Now with Dr. Theo. Morning, Theo. You good?
I'm very good, Andy. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
This may be the last sunny day before it rains.
Well, I hope so, actually, because my garden could certainly do with that. But we talked about the last podcast, but we're going to talk about today about midlife crisis, which
Yes.
probably fits into our category, really, because we're in that sort of age group ourselves. So I suppose we can draw some from experience, some from research, and some from sort of observation, I suppose, in terms of the insights that we've actually gained from this. So actually, I want to probably start asking you, what is a midlife crisis to start off with, and we'll follow on from there.
See, that's interesting because there isn't really a clear definition of it. The term itself was coined by a psychologist, Eliot in 1965. And what he was doing, he was describing people hitting middle age with a paradox of being in just about the prime of your life with maximum facilities available to you, whereas now you see it as dated because death is just over the hill. So you reach this crisis point, this existential anxiety point. And what's really interesting is that animals get it too. So studies with apes and orangutans and chimpanzees find that they dip in the middle of their lives in terms of happiness. And the theory is that this unhappiness dip, it acts as a natural motivator to get them going forwards and developing.
No, I mean, I none of this sounds skeptical, but when you talk about chimpanzees and orangutans, it depends which ones you're actually testing. I mean, are they being observed in the wild or are they being observed in captivity? Because let's face it, a chimpanzee or an orangutan in captivity is going to have a far different perspective of life in some ways than animals in the wild. I mean, I think there was talk about, is it the bonobo monkeys or something, and how the same sort of group of orangutans over generations got split down the middle of a river. One of them was always fighting for power and everything, and there was constant aggression and violence within that group. And the other group were all living a very sort of utopian, even sexual lifestyle, if you actually want to call it, if you actually look at the documentary, where because that side of the river was an abundance of food, so there was no need to fight for that level of position. Whereas on the other side, it was less available, so people fought for their little plots of land, but they all came from the same sort of DNA pool, if you actually want to call it that. So in some ways, it all depends how abundant you've actually achieved in life. Would you say?
You're describing effectively different cultures, aren't you? And different pressures within those cultures. And that also raises something else, that midlife crisis is commoner in the West than it is in the East. So let's hold that thought for a second. But studies show in America that about 26% of people have reported having a midlife crisis. But interestingly, it occurs, this midlife crisis occurs before 40 or after 50, which immediately raised the question, is it age that is causing the midlife crisis, or is it something else? And in fact, if you ask them, their midlife crises are brought on by major events such as divorce, job loss, loss of a loved one, or having to relocate for whatever reason. And the other issue, similar to the chimpanzees, is that we all naturally, excluding all these large changes, which people may have difficulty coping with, we all naturally go through a U-shaped happiness curve. So our happiness is highest in our adolescence and is highest as above 60. But about 40, our happiness is lowest. And because society tells us that things will just get worse and death is over the corner, when you're 40, you can only see yourself going one way, which is downhill.
I've got an opinion on that because I mean, why would you say? But before I give my opinion, what do you think? Why is 40 such a significant number? Is it because they've hit 40, and some people say life begins at 40 and things like this, and actually, my opinion. Actually, now let me ask you first. Why would you think 40 is a significant number? Before I share my theory, if you want to, if there's a better word for it.
Oh, that's really easy. Propaganda. So what's really fascinating is that there was a lady called Theodora Parsons, and she was the widow of an army officer at the beginning of the First World War, and she concentrated on physical therapy for ladies, and she wanted to focus on overweight 40-year-old ladies, and to make them fitter so they could then participate in the war effort in the absence of their husbands who were going to fight. So she would say that the best is yet to come, life begins at 40.
Right.
And what then happened was that tagline was then used with the American Dream. So in the American Dream was all about prescribing certain things to happen at certain times, because what happened is in the early part of the 20th century, the general population became more homogeneous. So what does that mean? It means we started doing things at the same time. So ladies started getting married earlier, average age of 20 to 24, men a bit older, and they started having fewer children, and they will cluster earlier on in the marriage. And therefore, what would then happen is you then have children growing up. And then about the age of 40, you'd then be stuck in between the problems of your kids at adolescence and then the problems that are approaching you with your elderly parents as they age. And also, because people live longer, then the money you get from inheritance, you get later. So where you could have used it most, bringing up your children, you don't have access to it then.
Yeah,
you have it later.
Yeah, it's because you bring up two different things. I mean, because particularly with men and women in particular, I think there's very two different perspectives on that 40 midlife crisis. I think when you look at 40 in terms of women, you're right. I think in those days, and even now to a degree, if people have a child younger, you're looking at about the age of 40, your kids are in adolescent age, they're beginning to become more independent, and the role of the mother in some ways, and you've put so much effort into bringing them up, and when they start moving on with their lives, your life becomes more less complete, because the thing is you've dedicated all this time to them, and now you've got all this time and space, and it becomes lonely because you've been on that. Men, on the other hand, and women actually, that's not to say one thing I've probably observed is when people leave, sort of, let's say they go to work, they start working in their, let's say, early 20s, if they leave university and things like that, what genuinely tends to happen is they're starting out on the ladder. Now, they will start, as people usually do, and we shouldn't compare ourselves to others, just compare ourselves to how we were the day before, really. I mean, if you consider Jordan Peterson's words in that respect. But once you start getting to about 40, there's between you and your peers, there's a separation of what you've achieved in your career. Some people will get promoted, and some people will or haven't advanced as much as they have. So by the time you reach 40, and you start questioning, where do I actually fit into the scale of things? So it's a level of significance, really.
You're right, because everyone started going through the same things at the same time, then there was another phrase coined in 1913, an American comic strip called Keeping Up with the Joneses. And therefore we all started comparing ourselves. And that basically is the evolutionary, if you want, origin of the poison of social media nowadays, where we're all comparing ourselves to everyone else. It's just staggering, and it started off an American comic strip. And interestingly, what also happened is, propaganda-wise, in the 1920s and 30s of the Great Recession, they didn't have jobs. So what they wanted to promote and push the American dream would be, as you got older and you've done your work, then you should expect to have more leisure, which means work less. So the idea there was to push older people out of work because they're being encouraged into a period of leisure in their life, so young people could get work.
Well, look, I mean, because a lot of the big corporates looks to start pushing you out at about 50-ish now. Because one, they're more expensive, and two, you want the younger people coming through, and you want to capture the younger talent earlier on. I mean, even sort of some of these corporate companies becoming so strategic in terms of targeting kids who are actually 16, 17 years old, probably even younger. You look at football. Some clubs will actually start searching for talent at 10, 11 years old, and actually get them on their books at a very young age. So in terms of the person who goes through the national progression of work and things like that, yeah, they get to 40 and it says that now there's distance between them and their peers. Some people are more successful, some people haven't reached that.
And of course, part of that problem is that society holds sacred the eternal youth theory.
Yeah.
That what is most important and held golden above all else is how much fun it is to be a child and an adolescent and young.
But here's the thing, is there, because the thing is, if you look at the way the world has changed, and it's almost like changed significantly after COVID, because there's this thing called, I think the terminology now is the Great Resignation, where all of a sudden people are actually resigning from their jobs and thinking, actually, I don't need to be doing this, because they survived through COVID on furlough and whatever, and they realised they weren't that dependent as they was perceived to be. So I have to be in this job, otherwise I'll lose my job. I won't have any money. I won't be able to do this. I won't be able to do that. And because they've survived the whole COVID thing, they're in this, and I know we've gone through this, what's called the gig economy, where people are going from little job to little job to little job, and it's all seemed to be going, a lot of it between the youngsters are going down that road, but people are realizing, says, actually, I want more of a quality of life than I do about the materialistic things. I mean, we're also talking about a small section of the population. I mean, you'll still get the others who will still go and do the corporate work, but even if you look at the BBC website today, people are only going into work now 1.5 times a week on average. Obviously, there are, as I said, there are exceptions to the rule, but people are going down that sort of space where they're actually working from home, which is going to cause extra problems, because an extroverted person needs to be in other people to feed off their energy. Introverted people are probably more comfortable working on their own. Mm-hmm. So, but the thing is, if you don't have a social life, let's say your family breaks down by 40, because I think probably the average age of divorce now is 46% or something, 48%.
Well, you see, that's one of the other things that what you're unfortunately describing is the reduction in culture and national identity and religion and family values, and it really again dates from the end of the Second World War, when the American dream had collapsed, and exactly at that point when they were trying to bring the economy back up and running, they tried to figure out how to get people to buy things. So, for instance, what they did is they recruited Freud's grandson, and he suggested to Ford Motor Cars that they say, drive this car and you'll be a man. You'll be seen as a successful man. And to women, put on this lipstick or put on this nail polish and you'll be beautiful. So what they did at that point, that was the origins of materialism. And so the American dream was replaced by happiness in a hurry, by instant gratification. And all the corporates since then have been selling instant gratification to us. And of course, even in, but it took a little bit of time, so you had you had the sexual revolution in the 60s with the contraceptive pill, for instance. So then there was even less requirement for the integrity of relationships, wasn't there, and therefore allowing promiscuity. Then you had the 1969 Divorce Act, where they changed the law, making it easier to, I think what was it, marital offence or something like that. They got rid of that term, and so you'd find what would happen is then people would hit a certain time where they literally had a time to start thinking, and it would be usually people who their kids have moved out, they are now left facing, looking at their wife, who now is no longer as attractive as she was, or the wife looking at the husband, and he's no longer as attractive as he was. The kids have moved out, they're stuck in middle management jobs, and they are saying, is this going to be the rest of my life? Can I face living this for the rest of my life? I have a right, because remember, the world has pushed materialism. I have a right to happiness, success, youth, sex, and I'm going to get rid of this person.
There's two things I probably want to add to that, actually, because you talked about, funny enough, the introduction of the pill in the 1960s, but you also you also probably I think it was homosexuality was made legal as well, which probably increased promiscuity in that respect as well, wasn't it, in the 1960s? So it was now a lot more open, far more open now. But I also want to go back even further, because you talk about the dream. We've been fed this dream even from the time we go to school. It's you have to study hard. You got to get a job. You got to, you got to progress. And I think someone described. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was many years ago. And it was the 40-40-40 club. So basically, you work for the next 40 years. Your aspiration is to earn over 40,000 a year, which in those days was a 40% tax rate, wasn't it? But I think it's changed now. I'm sure it's changed now. But it was the 40-40 club. So so work for 40 years, earn over £40,000 and pay over 40% tax, which was the model that people were aspiring to. That was supposed to be the dream. But it hasn't really sort of worked out. For some people, it doesn't work out like that. And it's a very steady, very comfortable life, I suppose, if you want to. Let's say you become a lawyer. You build up a good practice, you earn good money. But the thing is, you don't see the wife. You don't see the wife. She becomes lonely. So she looks to find her activity and her variety elsewhere.
Even my old professor of psychiatry on his retirement lecture, he said, let me give you a piece of advice. He said, what will happen is people think after the kids move out, let's downsize. We don't need this large house. But he said, whatever you do, don't downsize, because in that large house, you can still have your space. Whereas if you're in a smaller house, you have to look at your wife all the time.
Or she the husband, yeah.
But there's also biology, because obviously you can get older, and especially as people's diets has deteriorated with the high processed carb, so you'll begin to get more infirm. How many people suffer from gout, for instance, and that lays you out. And also there's biological factors in terms of ladies having menopause. So in fact, the 44 to 50-year-old ladies have the highest incidence of depression, almost certainly biologically related to the menopause and the drop in estrogen. Psychologically, also in terms of the fact that they're changing view of themselves in terms of their fertility and their role in society. And interestingly, white males who are in their late 50s have the highest incidence of suicide. And again, exactly why that is, and white as well, is because white males are the least family orientated, because everyone else who's moved in, all the immigrants, are more family orientated. So the white male is going to be the least integrated in society or in family. And if you are least integrated, if you have less of a role, and you will literally fall out of society, and you'll become depressed, and you'll think, what's the point of me even existing? And then you raise the risk of suicide.
Yeah, I mean, because of, sorry, it slipped my mind what I was going to say. Because yeah, because you get to a certain age, you feel you haven't achieved as much as you wanted to from what you actually dreamt of as well. That starts playing out in your mind. You've put on weight, so you've got a body image issue as well. Um, and some people become more withdrawn and embarrassed to even go out and do things. I mean, I know people, youngsters who don't even go on social media now because they're more worried about their body image and what people will say
Yeah.
about them.
But you see, that's the
So they
point.
will follow people.
So that's the modern version of keeping up with the Joneses. It's incredibly toxic.
But in some ways, it's always been toxic.
Mm.
So yeah, so
Comparison
it's
is the mother of discontent.
but the thing is, I mean, so you'll get people, and the thing is, you'll get people who'll be married and they've reached a certain age, they can't afford to split up, and a lot of people are trapped in that circle. And all of a sudden, they think, "Oh my God, can I really spend the next 30 years of my life with this person?" And
Well,
they'll start
they started.
exploring. They'll start going elsewhere.
Indeed, and in fact, that has been discussed, and the concept of serial marriages has been proposed. At one extreme, you had one theory was you have your marriage for your passion, and then a second one, marriage for kids, and the third one, marriage after kids. So you just have a companion that you enjoy being with, and you enjoy their company. Now that there is no reason that the same person can't fulfill all those roles.
So you mean having
But you,
multiple partners?
well,
Is that
there
what
is
you?
that theory, but also they also have discussed the fact the same person could fulfill those roles, but you've got to work on it. You can't expect to, uh, easily transition from one role to another.
But after 25, 30 years, how much effort do you really put in after 25, 30 years when life starts becoming a routine?
Well, that's right. But at the end of the day, it's about the covenant of marriage, which is about you do things for the other person, which inspires them to do things for you. But with materialism, it's always happiness in a hurry. It's the quick fix. It's what can I get out of it? And that's incredibly bad. And if you look at if you look at what makes you happy, there's the Harvard Happiness Study, which shows that it is the relationship with your immediate partner and close family, as long as you're not poor. And then the Sardinia Longevity Study, what makes you live long? And that is, although exercise, diet, blood pressure control, flu jab are all there, what is the two most important ones is one, the number of people you can depend on in a crisis. Two, the number of direct human contacts you have with it in a day with someone you know very well or someone you don't know very well, such as a shopkeeper. And even in the little village in Rosetta in Ottawa, which had the lowest ever in America incidence of heart attacks, which two doctors discussed in a medical conference. They then went and researched, and they thought, what is going on here? It was full of Italian immigrants. And what they discovered is these Italian immigrants were not super fit. They did not have a good Mediterranean diet. What they did is they lived in very, very close proximity with a high degree of respect for everyone's role. Okay.
Well,
So
that was going back to the whole
you had
village community, wasn't it?
yeah,
Small,
exactly. So
small community.
you have three or four generations living in the same house, and everyone's role is highly respected.
So let me.
Give example,
Sorry.
the
Okay.
the problem with jobs. Okay, now the idea again, this is pushed on us. You have to have your career and develop and optimize. Now, 98% of all everything available is not a career. It's a job, and a job is something you wouldn't be paid to do unless you wouldn't do unless you're paid to do it. 2% is careers. So what does that mean? It means that when you hit your 40s or 50s, you realize, hang on, this really isn't a career at all. I don't particularly like it, and I haven't really got anywhere or have a sense of fulfillment. And I've sacrificed myself and not focused on my kids or my marriage. And look where it's got me. And that
Living alone
realization,
in a one bedroom while you're
divorced and unhappy.
divorced,
So
yeah, and lonely, yes.
it's catastrophic. And again, I'm Greek, and my my grandparents were originally, although they were refugees from Asia Minor and Turkey, they settled in a Greek island, and it's a little Greek island, and there I could walk around and people would introduce themselves to me when I was a teenager and they say, you don't know me, I'm your second cousin, or I'm your uncle, or I'm your aunt. They wouldn't know me by sight. And within minutes, you could visit any number of relatives' houses, and
Yeah.
and everyone was close knit. The shopkeeper, the banker,
Yeah.
they all knew you if they weren't even
I
related to
mean,
you.
because you bring an interesting point up, because there's two things I want to touch on that. One is, I mean, look, when I was like 15, probably even younger than that, well, actually probably older than that, all the shops used to be closed on a Sunday. Very rarely would you see a shop open. If you wanted to get something, you'd go to a service station, if I remember. But people spend time with the families, and that's what maintained the family unity, which is what you're really talking about in some of these communities. So the question I really want to ask is, if people reach a midlife crisis at 50, and the thing is, we're really sort of focusing in this category, but really, do we actually have to go back to the very beginning of maybe the attention they got from their parents when they were younger, how they were dealt, how they fitted in at school? I mean, we talked about the playground penis Serengeti, in terms which is more Darwinian. Um, if it's affected them from a young age, like let's say 7, 8, 9 years old, to where they are by the time they hit that midlife crisis, is that when it gets shaped, or does it get shaped when you hit 40? Does that make
Well, I
sense?
think the playground stuff is you learning about socialization, doesn't it?
That's right, but your confidence, you learn about your confidence, you learn about your social skills, you learn about your identity in that young environment. If you don't actually come from a let's say an extended family, which is what we used to have in some
Yes.
ways, you got the love and
Well,
attention there, and if you don't get that and you feel very alone.
there is enormous power in identity, and the problem is that even going down to the Doomsday Book, people identified by their jobs, and as we know, um, jobs, you can, especially more recent, because in the early part of the 20th century, a man could expect to work 30, 40 years in the same job and then retire. This is no longer the case. And so if you keep on losing your job or having to change your job, your identity is being ripped from you, or you're having to remold it. And people are not very good at that. And then, of course, there's the other major source of identity is your family. Okay, I'm part of a family. But again, with materialism, people are now living in little boxes, or indeed in one-bedroom flats when they're divorced. And again, there's no sense of family. So that's a catastrophe. And what in therapy, one of the key things I teach my patients is, what is your identity? Because if you know your identity, you always take that with you, and not only that, but you can work on it and make it more powerful. Um, Now, of course, for centuries, identity was also included in your tribe. So it will be your religion, let's say, and religion is an enormously powerful identity. Um, you can't beat dogma with bombs. So no Western society has ever beaten a religious society, or exceptionally rarely, and certainly not consistently and permanently. Um, so one of the problems with materialism is it disintegrates values, family, culture, religion.
But that's how particularly the West works. We are a materialistic society.
And
In
which brings us back to the beginning, where I said that there is more midlife crisis in the West than there is in Eastern countries. Now, what goes on in Eastern countries?
They're more family
More
orientated.
family orientated, more culture, more national identity, more religion. Okay. Um,
But they feel supported in some ways because the family's around them, the
that's right.
extended family's around them. So they always know that they've actually got a level of support, and they find their role within that community. People, I mean, now, I know a good friend of mine. His two kids, one's actually now working in Singapore, barely sees them. One's living I think, in China, sort of same sort of
Mm.
industry, and so he gets to see them on a very infrequent basis. Um, but it's happening. It's happening all the time. People are immigrating, or they're traveling, or
A disaster, an
it's.
absolute
But
disaster.
we don't. Yeah, we don't have that. We don't have that sense of unity anymore.
And you know the in Greece, I've seen people get more unhappy in Greece in the last 30 to 40 years. The more westernized Greece has become. Even people living on this little Greek island, if they have a successful little shop, um, one of my uncles, he has on this little island, he's got 3 designer clothes shops.
Yeah.
And the millionaire yachts, well, they're his main customers. So they come in, they'll spend several £1,000s in one shopping trip. And so this guy living on this little Greek island has all this money. And he said, well, what's the point of all of this? Because he was working so hard and he was neglecting his wife. They were getting unhappy together. Do you see where I'm
Yeah,
coming
and
from?
I think it's quite evident, and I want to probably talk about the Eastern culture in a minute, but it was evident, particularly. I mean, we had a lot of Eastern Europeans in the UK just before COVID, and they've all, gone back, which is what affected the restaurant trade and things like this. But now they're not coming back because I think when they actually, and a lot of them, particularly a lot of the immigrants that we're getting right now, they think the grass is going to be greener in the Western world. They'll go to, they'll go to a lot of the colonized countries like Australia, Canada, even the US, the UK. So in Europe. And the thing is, they think the grass is green, and all of a sudden they're working these long hours for very little pay. And admittedly, they're sending money back home, but they've forsaken the whole family unity over there, and they've left their family behind. And some of them will pay some of these cartels and trafficking organizations thousands just to come over here, hoping then to bring their family over. But it doesn't really sort of work out like that, and then they really can't afford to go back. It's almost this vicious circle that they're living in. Some flourish. Many actually end up homeless as well. Um, and when you look at sort of the Eastern, you look about the Eastern culture, why would you want to leave? I mean, even sort of somewhere like Africa or even Northern Africa, why would you want to leave when you've got, okay, you probably don't have as much as you probably, actually, would you have as much? Because if you actually think about the amount of effort you put in for the reward, are you going to get the level of reward from the effort you put in by coming to the UK, whereas being with your family and everything? And people seem to ignore that because in some ways you call it propaganda. And it's very media driven. That's what you need to do.
Well, indeed. And the what's interesting is uh, I think Jordan Peterson he was talking about the fact that if the West was so bad, why do so many people want to come here? Um, and and the answer is because instant gratification is almost irresistible because it's your dopamine hit. And because we are all children, you see, religion gets it right. Religion understands the fact that we need to be taught, we need to be guided, and it needs to be repeated over and over, even several times in the same day. Whereas Western culture says, right, we'll teach you in your teenage, in your early 20s, and then you'll remember it for the rest of your life. Now, which do you think is more effective, the religious way or the Western way?
I think the Western way, actually.
Well, but the proof of the pudding is the fact we are more miserable. And remember that we talk about midlife crisis, but actually, depression itself was the 5th commonest cause of illness and death 30 years ago. It is now the commonest. Why? Okay, because of everything that the Western world has brought to us, everything that unregulated capitalism, materialism has brought to us, including financial stresses such as credit crunches, such as problems with wars, um, and that's the issue. We're not all suddenly clinically vulnerable to clinical depression. We're unhappy. This is a geopolitical. So that one of the most effective tools for the health of humanity is not antidepressants. I mean, of course, if you're clinically depressed and you need it, of course you should take it. Bearing in mind, we're not licensed and you should talk to a licensed practitioner. But the main issue is geopolitical. It is identity. It is religion. It is culture.
I'm just going to go way off base here and ask you: do you think there's an intent of wanting to make the average person poorer because they're more easily controlled, and because they don't feel they've got any control, that they actually are leading them to actually being more depressed?
Well, that's really interesting because, of course, the one of the major women's magazines was funded by the CIA, and the theory was that the CIA wanted to promote feminism, break up families to increase number of taxpayers. And indeed, in the 80s and early 90s, when women were really making a strong push to go to work and have careers, if you remember, and the government were reducing tax breaks for married couples and families and so on, there was this mini temporary celebration where both members of a couple were now earning money, so they could buy 2 cars and lots of TVs and lots of shoes and handbags. But of course, as soon as you increase the numbers in the workforce, but supply and demand laws mean that you're now devaluing. So now, 30 years later, what you're finding is that 2 members of a couple working are now earning as much as 1 member in terms of real
the quality
value.
of life.
Yep, exactly.
And the kids are the suffer because they're being stuck in front of iPads.
And now everyone's more miserable because you don't have family life, because the lady is also rushing out to her career and not attending to because you see, women are the nest builders. They are the affable, agreeable, socially skilled people. Because if you look at the emotion autistic spectrum, where you have hyper-emotional people on the left extreme and autistic, unemotional people on the right, then the average lady lies a bit left of center, the average man lies a bit right of center. So simply put, men are terrible at social skills on the whole. Of course, there's a big overlap, and we're talking generalities. And exactly because women are more emotional and empathic and agreeable, they also suffer more anxiety.
Because it's all about balance, isn't it? Because there's no balance. Because, I mean, you talked about this capitalist material world that we actually live in. But the thing is, because the other scale is, and I don't want to make this political in terms of, you got the sort of socialism or the radical left socialism that we're beginning to see, particularly more in the States. And I think people are keeping a close eye on it because what genuinely happens in the States tends to sort of transcend over here at some point. But the thing is, they want to spend all this money, but they need to rely on the capitalist structure in terms actually to actually get the tax money to be able to pay for all that. Now, if people aren't working, on the capitalist side, there's not money for the socialist side. Otherwise, you're going to get countries like Venezuela, and then you're going to get total anarchy and people literally killing each other for a pair of trainers.
Well, that's right, and it's as I've been saying now for over 20 years, our days in our current concept of society as we know it are numbered, because anything that affects and challenges structure is damaging, and materialism makes you entirely self-absorbed. And I was hoping that some kind of religion would help us. So the Muslims moving more into the UK. There's nothing wrong with suddenly the UK becoming Muslim as long as that becomes its identity. But of course, the problem is England is the religious Church of England, and the other problem is that Muslims become westernized. So then the other problem is they become equally materialistic.
They fall into they sort of they adapt, don't they, to a Western culture.
That's right, and then of course they are vilified in this anti-Muslim rhetoric. So then it then increases the expression of racism.
Yeah. Okay. So we've gone into the political side of things. Maybe there's probably valid explanations on that. But the thing is there anything we can really do about it? And I don't think there is. I mean, it's almost as though the rules of the game have been set, and we've got to fit into that rule. Even if we break some of those rules, we're still sticking to certain rules to maintain a formal structure that that we can live with, whether it's legal, whether it's political, whether it's economical, whatever.
Well, it's
But the
very.
thing is, if we live in this materialistic world, because we both live in London, but really, if it's a materialistic world we live in, what are we going to do? We're going to start making our own clothes, or we're going to start, if you choose, I don't want to live by those principles. There's not a lot else you can do.
You have to try as much as possible and focus on family and close community. That is the only choice you have, because all the research from our first origins of evolution points exactly to the importance of that.
And that's all good and well. And I don't disagree with you. I'm probably in line with what you're saying there. But here's the thing we talked about last week when we talked about diet and things like this and exercise. We thought people already know what they need to do to lose weight, but they're still not doing it. And I'll put that back to the family thing, because we've sort of got into this routine where family is not the same level of closeness that we had 40 years ago. It's very hard to actually go back into that old style when people have already moved on with their lives so much.
Well, it is very hard, but you see, some people do get it. So you see some older people just getting more and more involved in community projects and volunteering and stuff like that. So that is one very good example. But you're right, it's incredibly difficult, which is why I keep on saying the answer is more geopolitical. In other words, it has to come from the top. It has to be easier financially and more practical to bring together family units, and it needs to be encouraged, and it needs to be made easier to have children and encouraged.
I'm going to ask a very cynical question.
Because, for instance, give you an example. Jordan Peterson comes up with this beautiful quote. He says, there's only one real way of growing up, he said, and that's to become a parent. And people hate me for saying this because, I mean, there are other ways, but they're much, much harder. Because when you're a parent, there is someone who matters more than you do, unless you are narcissistic beyond redemption. Now, you're a parent, you're an adult. You might be good at it, less good at it, but the fact is there is now someone you will die for or live for. And then he goes on to say, he says, and people miss the importance of this. He says that one of the problems in modern society is the focus on youth and how great it is to be young and adolescent. Trust me, he says, it's better to be an adult. What does that mean? It means you're mature with responsibility, and you understand the importance of family, because that is the focus of happiness, the source of happiness.
I mean, I read an article of probably last year, actually, probably even during COVID in some ways, and they talked about this is the first generation that is not going to exceed their parents in terms of achievements, in terms of wealth and things like this. So when you talk about something like that, you'll find that parents are worrying about more their kids, because the standards they've been taught to be brought up with and conditioned are at the stage where they're seeing their kids on their Xbox and social media and not spending enough time.
The less guidance
and the work ethic.
The less guidance, the less certainty, the more comparison. The greater your expectation, the greater your entitlement, the more pleasure you seek. All of that will lead to unhappiness. And so right now, for instance, there was one provocative talk saying that actually the greatest midlife crisis is happening in millennials, because of course they've been given the least expectation of responsibility taking, where even marks at school, they're not allowed to be given red crosses, are they? These guys have no idea what type of responsibility to take and what direction to take their life in.
Yeah. So we've pretty much talked about the political reality in terms of why things have happened like this. We've talked about people having a midlife crisis. We talked about being unhappy. Actually, is there an answer to happiness? Can we all be happy, or is happiness just I'm not saying it's an illusion, because I think you've got to have some sort of level of unhappiness to actually appreciate happiness.
Well,
Do you understand that?
I
Otherwise,
do.
because you can't always be happy.
But
I
you
mean,
see, this is another
hold
concept.
on a second. Hold on, because there was a talk that they said that if someone wins the lottery, and another person becomes a paraplegic, they'll have the same levels of happiness within 18 months or so. I think it was a year or 18 months or
Dan
something.
Gilbert does a great TED talk on that. Yes. So, but the key thing to understand again is this obsession with happiness, because again people mix that with pleasure. And Epicurus, 2,500 years ago, ancient Greek philosopher, and Buddha, both these people started saying that the pursuit of happiness, because it is ephemeral and you ultimately know at the time it means nothing, so you know you have to continue pursuing it, will make you miserable. Okay? And what is important is peace of mind. That's what people really seek. They want a calm mind. And what gives you a calm mind? A happy family, a happy functioning family, with you knowing your role within it. And as you get older, your role will naturally change.
I mean, there's a lot of other aspects. I mean, the thing is, there's also financial stability as well at a certain age and things like that. I mean, how many marriages and arguments break out over, financial restrictions, I suppose.
Yeah, but even then,
So there's got to be a level of financial stability to give you peace of mind.
Yeah,
you're not
as long
gonna
as
have
you're
peace
not
of
poor.
mind.
As long as you're not poor.
Okay.
That's right. But if you're not poor, then it's irrelevant. In fact, I've seen plenty of people who are very well off, but because they don't have family, they hit their existential anxiety and get depressed and start questioning what the point of life is. Because they've got all these resources. What's the point?
Yeah, because I mean, you see a lot of famous people who have gone and committed suicide, and they've had super successful careers.
Mm.
And in fact, I think he even took some of them who suffer from huge amounts of depression the more successful they get.
Mm.
And some people can't process that.
And Socrates, he was his theory on love, and in fact, it's championed as the only theory that Socrates came up with that wasn't his own, and it was told him by a woman. So the irony is that he had to be explained by a woman what love was. And basically, the Oracle of Delphi said, no, Demeter at the Oracle of Delphi said that love is the pursuit of immortality. And she says some people will seek to mark the pages of history, curing cancer, saving the UK during the World War II. But most of us will settle for reproduction,
Okay.
which means what? Which means being in a functional family.
Yeah. Okay, so just to, because we're running out of time now on this podcast, what 3 takeaways can people do to actually alter the change, or make changes in their lives that's going to lead them to a more, let's say, peace of mind now?
Well, peace of mind is all about close family and community.
Not everyone has access to that, though.
It is also knowing your identity. So you've got to figure out your identity and who you are. Because remember, we did a podcast on freedom, and one of the problems with the materialism and modern society is that they define freedom as doing what you want, when you want, however much you want, whoever you want, as long as you don't cause harm. Now, as Jordan Peterson put it, that's the 2-year-old definition of freedom, and 2-year-olds require parental supervision. So my definition of freedom, or ours on the podcast, is the ability to function according to your values and beliefs in a functional environment.
Okay.
Now, if you can do that, you're going to be perfectly content.
Okay, well, I mean, thanks for that, Theo. Thanks very much for listening, everybody. And I think, I mean, we've touched on identity and figuring out your identity. And I think that's what we're going to focus on the podcast for next week, is figuring out your identity. Is that good enough? Is that, are we good to do that one next week?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thank you very much for listening, and speak to you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.